The soul of a new machine. 5 midnight programmer it was the hour of insomniacs. In the basement of Westborough, the corridors and cubicles stood empty and in shadows. Carl Alsing's cluttered little area made a small rectangle of light. Strewn before me across the surface of his desk, like the relics of a party, lay dozens of roughly drawn maps. They consisted of circles, inside of which were scrawled names such as Dirty Passage, Hall of Mists, Hall of the Mountain King, Complex Junction, Splendid Chamber, Bedquilt, and Wit's End. Webs of lines connected the circles, and each line was labeled, some with points of the compass, some with the words up and down. Here and there on the maps were notations: water here, oil here, and damn that pirate. In the midst of all this paper sat Alsing's computer terminal. On the screen of the tube in white letters, like the little voice that whispers in a wild gambler's ear, this message stood: "Are you sure you want to quit now?" Alsing had offered to demonstrate midnight programming, and now, early in the winter of 1979, he had made good on the promise. He was sitting beside his desk with his hands folded, wearing his soft, sneaky smile. For hours, he had been watching me play the game Adventure. "You really got into it," he said. "That's good." When first invented, the program for Adventure had traveled widely, like a chain letter, from coast to coast among computer engineers and buffs. It had arrived in Westborough just in time for the aftermath of the Ego Wars. It was everywhere by now. Grade schoolers were playing it. In the game, the computer appears to create for you an underground world called Colossal Cave. It moves you through it in response to your commands. The computer seems to act as game board, rule keeper, and when you foul up, as both assistant and adversary. You move by typing out directions on the keyboard at your terminal. If you spell out these directions in full a few times, a message will appear on your screen saying, "If you prefer, simply type N rather than north." How did the computer know to do that? "I don't know," said Alsing coyly. "Sometimes it's perceptive, other times just dumb." After you have moved, a message appears on the screen telling you where you are and what you are confronting. You must respond in 2 words or less, both to opportunities, treasure or tools lying on the floor of some chamber, and to threats and challenges: the hatchet-hurling dwarf, the snake, the troll who guards the bridge, the dragon. If, for instance, you want to get past the rusty door in one of the chambers, you have to think of what will conquer rust. Then you have to remember where it was you saw that pool of oil. Then you have to type in step-by-step instructions to get back to that oil. And then, because the computer will let you carry only so many things, you may have to drop one of your tools or treasures. Drop gold coins. You might write and then type in "take oil." Of course, you must already be holding a container for the oil. Then you have to retrace your steps back to the rusty door and type "oil door." This method of travel and maneuver takes some getting used to, but after a while it's as easy as driving a car. The game is a harrowing of hell. Earlier that night, traveling more or less at random and without maps, I had stumbled into a place that the message on the screen described this way: "You are in a maze of twisty little passages, all different." So I typed NW in a hurry, hoping to get out of there by going back the way I'd come. But the screen responded: "You are in a twisty maze of little passages, all different. If you are susceptible to adventure, you get worried at this point." I had the feeling I was lost in a forest, and I acted as no smart woodsman would, heading off in this direction, then heading off in that, and getting nowhere. Then I heard Alsing chuckle. "Ah, I love it." I thrashed around in that maze a while longer. Finally, Alsing said, "Look carefully at the messages on the screen. They're all the same." "No, they're not." Each chamber of this maze within the big labyrinth had a slightly different and unique address, formed by a particular arrangement of the words twisty, little, passages, and maze. "And what do you do when you get lost?" asked Alsing. "You make maps, of course." Alsing sat back and nodded, smiling, the complacent schoolmaster, one of the roles he played at the beginning of Eagle. Later on, though, I wandered into a maze that really scared me. You are in a maze of twisty little passages. All alike, you have to find your way around this maze if you hope to begin to master adventure. Because this one contains the vending machine with the batteries for your indispensable flashlight, and moreover, harbors the lair of the kleptomaniacal pirate, who is forever sneaking up behind you and snatching away your treasures. But how do you find your way around a maze in which all the chambers are the same? You must do what Hansel and Gretel tried to do, more or less. Drop something on the floor of every chamber to leave a trail marking where you've been. That isn't the worst maze, however. You can get caught in Wit's End and think that you'll never get out. Some of the engineers at Westborough who had come close to mastering the entire game believed that the only way out of wit's end was to tell the computer you want to commit suicide. Axe me. That works, you get reincarnated shortly afterward. But you lose points. Suicide isn't the best solution. I myself did not get as far as wit's end, however, but quit while in the maze that was all alike. And though the computer seemed reluctant to let me go, "Do you really want to quit now?" I stood firm. Alsing got up and led the way toward the cafeteria. He got us lost in the corridors of the basement. No doubt that was his plan, though he denied it. Intentional or not, our getting lost allowed him to cry out, "The twisty little passages of Data General." It was the time of night when the odd feeling of not being quite in focus comes and goes, and all things are mysterious. I resisted this feeling. It seemed worth remembering that adventure is just a program, a series of step-by-step commands stored in electrical code inside the computer. How can the machine perform its tricks? The general answer lies in the fact that computers can follow conditional instructions. They can take two values and compare them. That comes down to simple arithmetic, and if so commanded, can perform one action if the values are equal and another if they are not. In this ability to follow conditional instructions, an ability built into the machine, lies much of the computer's power. You can set before it, in sequence, bifurcating webs of conditional instructions until the machine appears to make sophisticated decisions on its own. When we had returned from our adventure finding coffee, I asked Alsing how he felt about the question, 20 years old now and really unresolved, of whether or not it's theoretically possible to imbue a computer with intelligence, to create in a machine, as they say, artificial intelligence. Alsing stepped around the question. Artificial intelligence takes you away from your own trip. What you want to do is look at the wheels of the machine, and if you like them, have fun. To the two computers that the Eclipse group used, the engineers had given the names Woodstock and Tracy, after characters in comic strips. They often spoke about these computers as if they had personalities. When especially frustrated, one micro-kid would walk into the lab where Tracy resided and yell at the machine. Alsing said, "A lot of people are really tired of anthropomorphizing computers, but it sure is an easy way to talk about them. You can anthropomorphize your car and the analogy works, and then at some level it doesn't. We anthropomorphize big business, the military, and so on, as some strange creatures with alien personalities. I think that's sane, I think that's normal. You tend to have to anthropomorphize the computer. It presents a face, a person to me, a person in 1,000 different ways." He drew his chair up to his terminal and typed a few letters, a short code that put him in touch with Tracy, which was the machine reserved for the use of his microcoding team. "We've anthropomorphized Tracy to a ridiculous extent," he said. He typed WHO. On the dark blue screen of the cathode ray tube with alacrity an answer appeared, Carl, where typed Alsing, in the road where else, Tracy replied. How? Error read the message on the screen. "Oh yeah, I forgot," said Alsing, and he typed, "Please HOW. That's for US to know and you to find out." Alsing seemed satisfied with that, and he typed when, "Right fucking now," wrote the machine. "WHY," wrote Alsing, "because we like to Carl." One of Alsing's micro-kids had programmed Tracy to deliver these impertinent responses. In a real sense, Alsing was conversing with a member of his team. I think one of them said as much, that if the micro-kid's computer had ever started talking back to them all on its own, they would have ripped its wires out. Anthropomorphizing Tracy was just a game, and by no means the most sophisticated that Alsing played with his team. They were the imps of the Eclipse group, and their computer showed it. Assembled from the comments of a few of the young men on the team, the typical engineer, an imaginary creature perhaps, wears a white undershirt and a plastic pouch, known to some as a nerd pack, in his breast pocket, in order to keep his pens from soiling his clothes. An electronic calculator, used to be a slide rule, hangs like a ring of janitor's keys from his belt. Jim Geyer of the Hardy Boys, who wore a beard and drove a large motorcycle, added, "A lot of people think that an engineer is shut off in a little corner and doesn't give a damn about anything else except his own little thing," Geyer said. "They exist, and they're the most obvious engineers because in their isolation they're obvious." When first encountered, Alsing might seem to fit this description. He could be taken for one accustomed to dark corners. In this respect, as in others, he is deceiving. Alsing is tall, over 6 feet, but he doesn't seem to realize it, and he doesn't look that big. He is neither fat nor thin. He keeps his hair cut fairly short. Often his dress looks sloppy, not deliberately or extremely so, but slightly careless. He speaks softly, as a rule, and the pitch of his voice, though not at all squeaky, is high. About his hands, the way he folds them in his lap or puts them together under his chin, there is something delicate. One acquaintance of his said, "He looks uncoordinated." In fact, Alsing does not play many physical games, though on a vacation in the Caribbean he took up scuba diving. Ham radio is an old hobby of his. I thought that I could see in him the lonely childhood behind him. He would have been the last boy picked in every schoolyard game, the one who threw a ball like a girl. But Alsing is gregarious. He set out some years back to master social gracefulness, and it shows. He will sit down in a strange living room, fold his hands neatly in his lap, and listen. You can forget that he is there until gradually, so delicately you hardly notice, he enters the conversation. After several such occasions, people who had just met Alsing said to me, "He's really smart and interesting, isn't he?" By the time the Eagle Project began, Alsing had attained the age of 35, which made him very elderly within the group. But he was a clever and playful old codger. His eyes would dart around. His eyebrows would dance. They'd do his winking for him. When he'd close his mouth and let a little smile creep across his cheeks, in each one was carved a line in the shape of a half-moon. Then it was time to be on guard for a game, a trick, or a joke. Alsing's childhood did not leave him with an abundance of sweet memories. Discovering the telephone was one of his fondest. When he was 8 and in 3rd grade, his family moved from central Massachusetts to Evansville, Indiana. He loathed that place. "I was smaller, paler, weaker, less rugged, and I had a funny accent. I remember discovering in 3rd grade that there was a pecking order. Hey, there's a pile and I'm on the bottom of it." I was a very depressed kid in 3rd grade. He vividly recalled the day when he skipped recess, usually a painful event for him anyway, and instead worked at his desk on the design of a telephone. He wanted to find out how the thing could possibly capture a voice. It seemed to him an improbable instrument, one that shouldn't work. He read about telephones in several encyclopedias. Then he took the family phone apart. Finally, he figured it out to his satisfaction. This was a fantastic high, something I could get absorbed in and forget that I had these other social problems. One day, while at home in Evansville, he was prowling around the basement and noticed wires running across the ceiling of the coal bin. He traced them back to the phone upstairs. He got a hold of some batteries, an old microphone, and an ancient set of earphones, and from the coal bin, sitting there all alone in the grime with the earphones on, he tapped the family's telephone. Once in a while, he accidentally short-circuited it, but his father, an engineer for Westinghouse who designed refrigerators, was indulgent on that score. Some years later, Alsing's family returned to New England, and he enrolled at the University of Massachusetts. He made mostly poor marks. Then, in his junior year, he took a course in the theory of digital circuits. It entailed, as such courses always do, the study of Boolean algebra. Alsing's world was never the same after that. Fathoming this algebra, Alsing felt as some children do when all at once they know how to read. Boolean algebra was something that made perfect sense, and thus it was a rare commodity for him. He called it beautiful. At the heart of the computer lies a device made up largely of transistors. Engineers call this device a gate, and the analogy is apt. You might think of it as a newfangled, automatic barnyard gate in an electrical fence. If the gate is closed, current flows through it along the length of the fence. But the current stops at the gate when it stands open. You open and close this gate by sending signals to it down 2 or more, let's say it's 2, control wires. How can you add 2 numbers together with electricity? For Alsing, the question had the force of those that the telephone had long ago aroused in him. You assumed, first of all, that you were going to do your adding in binary arithmetic. It was simple once you got the hang of it. You can count as high as you like in binary, but you use only the integers 0 and 1. The 0 of the familiar decimal arithmetic is 0 in binary, and the 1 in decimal is also 1 in binary. But 2 in decimal is 10 in binary, 3 is 11, and so on. Next, you let a high voltage represent the binary integer 1, and a low voltage represent the binary integer 0. Then you build a gate, which for all practical purposes is a binary device. It's either opened or closed. When opened, it passes on a low voltage, which stands for 0. Closed, it passes on the symbol for 1. What's crucial is how this gate responds to signals from the 2 wires that control it. You can build your gate in such a way that it will close and pass on the electrical symbol for a 1 if, and only if, one of its control wires sends it a 1, and the other sends it a 0. A gate built this way thus will add 0 and 1 and yield the right answer every time. But if you want to add 1 and 1 and get the right answer, which is binary 10, then you have to modify your circuit. And if you want to add large numbers together, you have to build a large array of gates and control wires. Suppose you want to build an adder that can combine two 32-bit packets. The diagram for such a circuit looks forbiddingly complex. How can you be sure that for every possible set of signals you put into this circuit, it will produce just the right pattern of opened and closed gates to yield up the right answer? You need a set of rules, Boolean algebra, for instance. Conventional algebra sets rules about the relationships between numbers. Boolean algebra expresses relationships between statements. It is a system of logic. It sets general conditions under which combinations of statements are either true or false. In this sense, it is a binary system. What Alsing studied was in fact a simplified form of Boolean algebra, one that had been tailored to digital circuits. If and only if A is true and B is true, then their combination is also true. That is one of the statements of the algebra. There are others, and it turns out that gates can be built so that they behave precisely according to these statements. Indeed, the kinds of gates are named for the Boolean statements that they mimic. There are, among others, AND gates, NAND gates, OR gates, NOR gates. Boolean algebra provides one systematic way for engineers to design their circuits. It is less important for that purpose than formerly, but it was a crucial tool in Alsing's college days. The time was the middle 60s. The computer was a famous and closely held marvel. The day had not arrived when curious undergraduates could buy the parts and figure out the thing by building one themselves. But here, in the course that Alsing took, lay the secret of the machine. It was so simple, so elegant, he said. He got an A in that course. So he took a course in how to program a computer by using a high-level computer language called Fortran, which was developed for scientists mainly. Alsing got an A in that. He flunked everything else, because of an actual computer. It was an IBM machine, archaic now but gaudy then. The university owned it in effect, and it lay inside a room that none but the machine's professional caretakers could enter during the day. But Alsing found out that a student could just walk into that room at night and play with the computer. Alsing didn't drink much, and he never took any other drugs. "I was a midnight programmer," he confessed. During the first nights after he learned to write a computer program, Alsing would go off from the computer room and search the empty building, looking for a classroom with a blackboard and some chalk. He posed problems for himself, and on the blackboard wrote up little programs for their automatic solution. Then he hurried back to the computer to try out his programs on the machine. That was what made it fun. He could actually touch the machine and make it obey him. I'd run a little program, and when it worked, I'd get a little high, and then I'd do another. It was neat. I loved writing programs. I could control the machine. I could make it express my own thoughts. It was an expansion of the mind to have a computer. About 10 other young, male undergraduates regularly attended these sessions of midnight programming. It was a whole subculture. It's been popularized now, but it was a secret cult in my days, said Alsing. The game of programming, and it is a game, was so fascinating. We'd stay up all night and experience it. It really is like a drug, I think. A few of his fellow midnight programmers began to ignore their girlfriends and eventually lost them for the sake of playing with the machine all night. Some started sleeping days and missed all their classes, thereby ruining their grades. Alsing and a few others flunked out of school. In a book called Computer Power and Human Reason, a professor of computer science at MIT named Joseph Weizenbaum writes of a malady he calls the compulsion to program. He describes the afflicted as bright young men of disheveled appearance, often with sunken, glowing eyes, who play out megalomaniacal fantasies of omnipotence at computer consoles. They sit at their machines, he writes, their arms tensed and waiting to fire their fingers, already poised to strike, at the buttons and keys on which their attention seems to be as riveted as a gambler's on the rolling dice. Was this a portrait of Alsing playing with that old IBM? In order to explain the hold that machine once had on him, Alsing had insisted that we confront Tracy late at night. As if preparing for a journey or an execution, we had dined well that evening. And when we'd gotten to the basement, he decided to start me on the way to addiction with small stuff. That is, with adventure. I'd played and played. One by one, the night owls of the basement, and there were many in the Eclipse group then, had departed. I'd kept on playing. When I finally quit, I felt weary in my bones. I was actually sweating, my shirt stuck to my back. Things around me kept going in and out of focus. I looked at Alsing, and the rims of his eyes were red. He said he could remember experiencing weariness like this during his midnight programming days, but he had been younger then. Weariness had been a badge and part of the fun. Some of his cohorts had suffered, it was true. But college kids are vulnerable. They can get taken down by girls or drink or by programming. As for him, he felt that he had gained far more than he had lost. Up until that year when he discovered the machine, his life, every way he had looked at it, had seemed chaotic. He had done fairly well in a course in psychology, but in nothing else. He had proven to himself that he was an inveterate failure. Now, finally, he felt truly interested in something. He left college for a year. When he came back, he took a number of courses in electrical engineering and became a straight-A student. He took a job with DEC when he graduated, then went to Data General, partly because he thought it would be a lively place to work. He got that idea from the famous first ad, and from the angry talk about Data General he heard in the hallways at DEC. At Data General, the number of your security badge reflects your longevity. The lower the number, the longer your service. By 1979, new employees were receiving badges numbered in 5 figures. Alsing wore number 150, which was low enough to confer upon him some status, and he thought, perhaps a measure of security. According to several stories, DeCastro had shown a special loyalty toward those who had joined his company early on and stayed. At Data General, Alsing became a microcoder. In fact, he was Data General's first and most prolific one. Most new microcoders on their first job have the odd feeling that what they're doing can't possibly be real. I didn't fully believe until I saw it work that microcode wasn't just a lie, said Alsing's main submanager, Chuck Holland, remembering the first code that he wrote. At the level of the microcode, physical and abstract meet. The microcode controls the actual circuits. A stairway of sorts leads down into a computer. At the top stand the high-level languages. A number of these exist, and more are on the way all the time. They vaguely resemble human languages, and they remain the same no matter what computer a programmer uses. Alsing wanted me to write a little program in the high-level language called BASIC, which resembles a pidgin English. In one part of my program, I ordered a simple division of 2 numbers, a command that in BASIC is represented by a slash. Slash! I typed the program into Tracy via Alsing's terminal. What happened to the slash? Inside Tracy's storage system lay a number of programs called interpreters. There was one for BASIC, and that interpreter program worked on my high-level program. Actually, the interpreter gave Tracy instructions as to how to begin translating my program into instructions that Tracy's circuits could respond to. Computers compute in order to compute. The interpreter for BASIC had Tracy translate the slash into so-called assembly language. It is commonplace today for programmers to stick exclusively to high-level languages and never look inside their machines. Alsing felt that they were missing something. He remembered learning assembly language during his time of midnight programming. It was neat to learn it. I could skip the middleman and talk right to the machine. It was also great for me to learn that priestly language. I could talk to God just like IBM. Written down outside the machine, assembly language is a list of mnemonics, such as ADD, skip on equal, and so on. It contains the names of all the roughly 200 basic operations that Tracy can perform. Instructions, these operations are called. Inside the machine, these instructions exist, of course, in the form of electrical charges. No single instruction in Tracy's set was equivalent to the slash. The slash became a series of several discrete instructions. Not many years before, in most computers, the slash, once it had been translated into its constituent assembly language instructions, would have been fed right into the actual circuits. A computer in which the stairway ends there, at the level of assembly language, is said to be hardwired. It has circuits especially designed to perform each basic operation in the machine's instruction set. But by the 70s, again, in most computers, assembly language no longer went directly to the circuits, but was itself translated into another language called microcode. For each assembly language instruction, there exists a microprogram, and most microprograms consist of several microinstructions. Each of Tracy's microinstructions, in turn, consists of 75 bits. Seen written on a page, a microinstruction is a string of zeros and ones. These correspond directly, of course, to strings of high and low voltages stored in a special place inside the computer, a micro-storage compartment. Each string of 75 bits is divided into portions, and each portion is destined for some part or parts of the machine's circuitry. The 75 bits of each micro-instruction are the actual signals that will make the gates in the circuits open and close in just the right patterns. So my slash became a linked list of, let's say, 10 assembly language instructions, each of which became a microprogram, each of which consisted, on the average, of 3 micro-instructions, each of which consisted of 75 bits. The simple slash was now platoons of signals, which were sent out one after the other, causing Tracy's circuits to take the 2 numbers I had provided for division, to translate these numbers into electrical code, to determine which was to be divided by which, to run the now encoded numbers through the arithmetic and logic unit in such a way as to divide them, a labyrinthine passage itself, and to put the answer somewhere for the next step in my program. Actually, far more micro steps than that occurred. Indeed, the physical machine responds only to microcode. It was microcode at bottom that caused Tracy to translate my slash into microcode. In this sense, the computer chases its tail. Since I'd asked for it, the result of this one operation in my little program, the quotient of my division, returned through another complex process, at the end of which it appeared on the screen of Alsing's cathode ray tube in the form of a decimal number. The entire journey, from the moment when I ordered that the program run to the time when the answer to the division appeared, occurred in an imperceptible moment, no more noticeable than the time it takes for a light to go on after its switch is thrown. But the speed seemed less impressive than the sheer volume of action that had occurred. I had this small revelation. Division was, after all, the name of something intricate. Some modern computers, most notably the machines of Seymour Cray, remain hardwired. They respond directly to the electrical equivalent of assembly language. Microcode just makes the language more specific. Microcode is, in this sense, like early Old English, in which there was no word for fighting, and a poet who wished to convey the idea of battle had to describe one. The chief advantage of microcode is flexibility, which accrues mainly to the builder of computers. If, for instance, unforeseen defects crop up after a machine has gone to market, and this almost always happens, the manufacturer can often repair them without changing printed circuit boards. Often the microcode can be altered instead, at considerably smaller cost. Eagle would be designed to make such changes especially cheap and painless. The code would exist on a so-called floppy disk, like a 45 RPM record, not in unalterable ROMs inside the machine. Each morning, when starting up the computer, the operator would play the disk into the circuits of Eagle's micro-storage compartment. If the code had to be changed, the engineers could merely change the floppy disk and send a new copy to customers. Writing microcode, however, is no simple task. The code is by definition intricate. To make the machine execute just one of its 200 or 300 basic instructions, the coder usually has to plan the passage of hundreds of signals through hundreds of gates. Limited storage space forces the coder to economize, to make one microinstruction accomplish more than one task, for example. At the same time, though, the coder must take care that one microinstruction does not foul up the performance of another. Alsing had written fat volumes of microcode in an extremely quirky way. The Eclipse was to be Data General's first microcoded machine. Alsing signed up for the job. There was signing up in those days, too, and then he procrastinated. Month after month, his boss would ask him how the code was coming along, and he would say, "Fine, a few problems, but pretty well." In fact, though, he had not yet written a single line of code. Finally, he could sense that his boss and some of his colleagues were growing angry. Failure had become an almost palpable object, a pair of headlights coming toward him down the wrong side of a road. Scared, he packed up the necessary circuit diagrams, specs, and manuals, and went to the Boston Public Library. The Eclipse contained 195 assembly language instructions, which in the end Alsing encoded in some 390 microinstructions, many of which performed multiple duties. He said he wrote most of those microinstructions in 2 weeks at the library. Perhaps it really took him less. West believed that Alsing did it all in 2 days and nights. Without question, he did, West insisted. It was always this way with Alsing. The summer before the Eagle project began, he was assigned to write the code for a new Eclipse. As usual, he stalled, and when he felt that he was about to get in trouble, he went home with an armful of books. He lived about 15 miles from Data General, in a new ranch house. "My micro porch," he said, showing me into a small, screened porch. We looked out on a nearby grove of white pines and smelled the needles on the floor of the woods. The room contained a bright green outdoor carpet, an electric grill for barbecues, some uncomfortable-looking wrought iron chairs, and a table with a glass top. That summer, he had asked his wife to keep his 3 sons away from there for a while, had deposited his manuals on the tabletop, and had started to think. Again, he did the entire job in a rush and finished in about 2 weeks. "A quick hit," he said. Much of the engineering of computers takes place in silence, while engineers pace in hallways or sit alone and gaze at blank pages. Alsing favored the porch and staring out at trees. When writing code, he said, he often felt that he was playing an intense game of chess with a worthy opponent. He went on, "Writing microcode is like nothing else in my life. For days, there's nothing coming out. The empty yellow pad sits there in front of me, reminding me of my inadequacy. Finally, it starts to come. I feel good. That feeds it, and finally I get into a mental state where I'm a micro-code writing machine. It's like being an adventure. Adventure's a completely bogus world, but when you're there, you're there. You have to understand the problem thoroughly, and you have to have thought of all the myriad ways in which you can put your microverbs together. You have 100 L-shaped blocks to build a building. You take all the pieces, put them together, pull them apart, put them together. After a while, you're like a kid on a jungle gym. There are all these constructs in your mind, and you can swing from one to the other with ease. I've done this in short intervals for a short period each year. There's low intensity before it and a letdown at the end. There's a big section where you come down off it, and sometimes you do it awkwardly and feel a little strange, wobbly, and tired, and you want to say to your friends, 'Hey, I'm back.'" If simplicity is elegance, then Alsing's code for the Eclipse was a kludge. It was full of tricks and subtleties, but for a purpose. He had at his disposal a severely limited storage space, and his concoction worked well in the end. It takes no imagination to see, however, that for someone trying to manage the invention of a computer, Alsing's style could provoke nightmares. Afterward, when the first Eclipse was sent to market, Alsing felt proud. "I did a damn good job," he told himself. He received what he still felt was a touch of glory. He was asked to attend the conference at which the company's salesmen were briefed about the new machine. Grinning, Alsing remembered one of the executives saying to the salesmen, "Okay, here's your brochures. You can jack off to them on the plane home." Alsing was asked to say a few words. The salesmen applauded. "That was pretty rich stuff to me, coming out of the cellar and receiving all that fame and attention." But his habit of putting off the creation of his code until all was almost lost probably did hurt him. During his months of procrastination, he wondered why he couldn't get down to work and came to believe that he was simply lazy. And he guessed that he let it show in little ways. An averting of the eyes, a slump in the shoulders. And partly because of that, perhaps, and certainly because of the anxiety he created, he did not receive a substantial gift of stock for his work on the Eclipse, although some other engineers got tidy rewards. One time West happened to mention Alsing's name to an executive upstairs, and the executive said, "You know, it's funny, but when you think about it, Alsing's written just about every line of microcode that's come out of Data General." Alsing did make himself easy to overlook. By his own account, he deliberately obscured himself in West's shadow. He went to work for West, he said, after West took over the Eclipse group, largely because he felt that it would be safer to stand on West's side than not. West, almost overnight, had become formidable. For Alsing, West represented a buffer and a shield. He had some other reasons, though, for signing up to help West on the Eagle project. Kludge made Alsing imagine a wheel built out of bricks, with wooden wedges in between them. Such a thing might work, but no sane engineer would be proud to have designed it. Alsing tended to agree with those who maintained that Eagle must, by definition, be something of a kludge. He did believe it when West said that Eagle could put a lot of money on Data General's bottom line, but past experience made Alsing doubt that he would ever see any of the loot. He even thought sometimes that if he went on helping to pound out 16-bit Eclipses and never worked on another big new machine, he would be a little bored but probably content. Nevertheless, Alsing stood with West from the start of Eagle, and he never asked for coaxing. "West's not a technical genius. He's perfect for making it all work. He's got to move forward. He doesn't put off the tough problem the way I do. He's fearless, he's a great politician, he's arbitrary, sometimes he's ruthless." Alsing laced his hands together so that his knuckles made an arch, on which he rested his chin. Why was West so obsessed about this machine? How would it all end? Sometimes, Alsing said, he felt he had joined up mainly to find out. He went on, "I screamed and hollered over NAND gates and micro-instructions with the first Eclipse, but I'm too old to feel that way about computers now. This would be crashingly dull if I was doing it for someone else. West is interesting. He's the main reason why I do what I do. Looking around the basement, some of the team's brand new engineers would sometimes wonder what would happen to them when they turned 30. Being young, they could make light of the question and say, as one did, when a computer engineer gets old, he gets turned out to pasture or else made into dog food. Data General was a young company, and so its engineers tended to be young. There really was such a thing in the world as a practicing middle-aged computer engineer. It did appear, however, management handbooks say so, that many engineers experience a change of life when they reach the age of 30 or so. Among engineers generally, the most common form of ambition, the one made most socially acceptable, has been the desire to become a manager. If you don't become one by a certain age, then in the eyes of many of your peers you become a failure. Among computer engineers, I think, the wish to manage must be a virtual instinct. The industry's short product cycles lend to many projects an atmosphere of crisis, so that computer engineering, which is arduous enough in itself, often becomes intense. The hours are long, emotions get taxed. Moreover, the technology of computers changes constantly. Every year it's a struggle to keep up with the youngsters fresh out of school. What another of West's old hands called a long-term tiredness can easily creep over computer engineers in their 30s. From the start of Eagle, Alsing disengaged himself from much of the technical work on the machine. He was running the micro team, but from a little distance. Eagle would contain more code than any Data General machine before it, as much code as Alsing had written in his entire career. Alsing could not write all of it, even if there were time. He simply could not generate the excitement he used to feel about gates and bits. Moreover, he believed that since he could not write all of the code, then he couldn't write any of it. These new kids, he saw, approached the job in a way he never had. They worked steadily, day after day, night after night. That was fortunate for the sake of the team. Alsing admired their discipline. He believed that it exceeded his by far. So he left the writing of the code to half a dozen new recruits, and most of the supervision of their work to submanagers. Sometimes Alsing worried about his detachment. Although I sometimes say I don't care too much this time around if I were to lose this. If I were to be fired or transferred to another project more mundane, I would be, very unhappy. Maybe I'm starting to take this place for granted, he said once. For a time when he was still in college, Alsing had wanted to become a psychologist. He adopted that sort of role now. Although he did keep track of his team's technical progress, he acted most visibly as the social director of the micro team, and often of the entire Eclipse group. Fairly early in the project, Chuck Holland had complained, "Alsing's hard to be a manager for because he goes around you a lot and tells your people to do something else." But Holland also conceded. "The good thing about him is that you can go and talk to him. He's more of a regular guy than most managers." Alsing created the micro team. He chose its members and he gave them their first training, with some help from Rosemary Seal. Nowadays it takes a computer to build a new computer, especially when it comes to writing microcode for one. Alsing figured that before the micro kids did anything else, they must learn how to manipulate Trixie. He didn't want simply to give them a stack of manuals and say, "Figure it out." So he made up a game. As the micro kids arrived, in ones and twos, during the summer of 1978, he told each of them to figure how to write a certain kind of program in Trixie's assembly language. This program must fetch and print out the contents of a certain file, stored inside the computer. "So they learned the way around the system and they were very pleased," said Alsing. "But when they came to the file finally, they found that access to it was denied them. The file in question lay open only to people endowed with what were called superuser privileges. Alsing had expected the recruits to learn how to find this file and, in the process, to master the system. He was equally interested in seeing what they would do when they found they couldn't get the file. One after the other, they came to him and said, "I almost have it." "Okay," said Alsing, "but you don't have it." In the end, most microkids went to Rosemary. Alsing had conferred with her beforehand. She was to help the microkids find the file if they asked. They learned something, Alsing felt. If a person knows how to get the right secretary, he can get everything. It was a resourceful solution, one of the solutions I hoped they'd find. This first game led to others. Not long after the recruits arrived, the tube wars began. As a rule, it was the kids against Alsing. In one commonly used gambit, a microkid would sit down at a terminal and order Trixie to open up Alsing's files. The microkid would then move the files to a new location. Returning from coffee or lunch, Alsing would find his files gone. He'd hear tittering from the cubicles nearby, and he would know he'd been too bored. "What did you do to me?" he'd cry. "Find out, stupid," a voice would answer. The micro kids weren't the only ones playing games with the computers in the basement. A young woman worked for Rosemary. She was unmarried and, by general consensus, good-looking. Every day for a couple of weeks during the Eagle project, she was assaulted at her desk. She would be doing her electronic paperwork when suddenly everything would go haywire. All her labor would be spoiled, and on the screen of her cathode ray tube would appear cold, lascivious suggestions. "Whoever was doing it," said West, "had the mentality of an assassin." West put Alsing on the case. Alsing had some members of the team lay traps inside the computer system, traps designed to leave a trail back to the Masher's terminal. But the Masher spotted all of these. One time he made his escape by bringing to an abrupt halt the entire system on which most of the engineering departments relied. He had to be stopped, and eventually Alsing found a strong suspect, a young man outside the group. Alsing had a casual chat with him about all the marvelous tricks that could be played with the in-house computing system. Afterward, the obscene messages ceased. Wholesomeness in this regard returned to the basement. Indeed, said one young engineer, the place seemed antiseptic. The Masher's game had been especially nasty and unfair, Alsing pointed out, because the victim could not fight back. But tube wars pitted worthy adversaries against each other. The jousting did no harm and, on the contrary, released tension. One day Alsing came back from lunch and went to work at his terminal. Everything looked right, all his files seemed to be in place, until he tried to do something with them. Then, to his surprise, he found that all of them were vacant. It was like opening a filing cabinet and finding all the folders empty. They were dummy files. It took me an hour to find the real ones, so now I can never be sure when I log on the system that what I see is real. Alsing struck back. He created an encrypted file and tantalized the team. "There's erotic writing in there, and if you can find it, you can read it." They tried, and ultimately all gave up, including Bob Beauchamp. Alsing taunted Beauchamp, though. So Beauchamp tried again. This time he wrote a program that broke Alsing's encryption system. "He beat me," Alsing said, "but I think he was too much of a gentleman to read what was inside." Alsing double-encrypted the secrets in his files after that, and for many months he assumed they were safe. Beauchamp abandoned his first approach, feeling that it was a little crude. Now he made a slight revision in Trixie's operating system. In essence, he instructed the machine that whenever Alsing encrypted a message, the operating system should send to Beauchamp's files an unencrypted copy. This was the ultimate victory in tube wars, not least of all because Alsing never learned what Beauchamp had done to him until Beauchamp himself spilled the beans. Tube wars died out slowly. At their height, whenever I visited Alsing, I'd take a look at the screen of his cathode ray tube and almost always see something peculiar written on it. Some message or picture sent to him by a young engineer at play. I'd come into Alsing's cubicle, and there on the screen would be a picture of a fist with the middle finger extended. Or there'd be a little story on his screen. Sex Life of an Electrician, Part 3, fully excited MILLIE amp mumbled ohm. 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 Alsing arranged several sorts of social gatherings. Among them, a weekly meeting of the micro team held around a table in a barren little conference room that contained one tiny window. I went to a couple of these convocations. Alsing would call the assembly to order, read a few announcements, and then submit to teasing. I read about someone who did a study of his company and discovered that he was the least important employee. "So he quit," Alsing said. "So long, Carl," cried one of the micro kids. There was a lot of talk about Alsing's idea that they should hand out honorable member of the microcode group awards. "I think we ought to give one to West," said one of the team, "so that when we get pissed off at him, we can take it back." "No," said another, "because now he'll be a member of the micro team. He can solve his own problems." They did do some business, using the beautiful and, to me, inscrutable language of the microelectronic era. Hex addresses, default radix, floating point mantisses, swap bytes, syslog, sim.dot, scratch pad. "The scratch pad doesn't come alive on CPD until 116, said one. "That means all the stack tests go away," cried another. "That's right." There was laughter all around the table. When it died away, a micro kid said, "Look, we can speed up Eagle's stack stuff by putting in a scratch pad." "Can we," asked another, "also plant a little bomb in the thing?" Alsing sat with his hands folded, smiling subtly. He looked like a big, contented cat. No one actually called an end to the meeting. It simply petered out in laughter. And yet there was bad feeling among some of them, much of it directed toward Alsing. And even then, petty intrigue was in progress. Some of the team would eventually describe the weekly micro-meetings as Alsing's weekly no-op. No-op being the name of an assembly language instruction that accomplishes nothing. For a long time, however, almost all of the recruits enjoyed these meetings, the tube wars and other entertainments that Alsing arranged. He made a point of sharing lunchtime with some of them several days a week, and they appreciated Alsing's friendliness. They could always talk to him. Alsing believed that the team's managers, in handling the new recruits, really were practicing what was called the mushroom theory of management. It was an old expression, used in many other corners of corporate America. The Eclipse Group's managers defined it as follows: put 'em in the dark, feed 'em shit, and watch 'em grow. It was a joke with substance, Alsing felt, and he believed that their mushroom management needed an occasional antidote. Alsing, in effect, had signed up to provide the kids with some relief from their toil. West warned him several times, "If you get too close to the people who work for you, Alsing, you're gonna get burned." But West didn't interfere, and he soon stopped issuing warnings. One evening, while alone with West in West's office, Alsing said, "Tom, the kids think you're an ogre. You don't even say hello to them." West smiled and replied, "You're doing fine, Alsing.